Welcome to our study of 2 Corinthians. Paul had to write this second epistle to the Corinthians due to the rejection by some of his first epistle and apostolic authority. These false teachers, who had sought to lord over the people, had sought to incite the people against Paul's teachings and authority. The title 2 Corinthians designates the numerical order and place to which Paul had written. As far as the authorship, you can see that which is under 1 Corinthians and other Pauline epistles. From 2 Corinthians 12:14 and 13:1, we can correctly understand that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians while he was going to Corinth for the third time. From the epistle itself, we know that 2 Corinthians was written from Macedonia. At precisely what place in Macedonia is not stated. It's generally understood that it was probably from Philippi. The question is when the second trip was made to Corinth. Acts is silent about that trip. It does not tell us anything about that second trip. The traditional view places the second trip or the second visit before the writing of 1 Corinthians, but more recent scholars suggest that it was a trip sometime between 1 and 2 Corinthians. So Paul was very concerned about the Corinthians. It was a troublesome church for him. They were a carnal church, and because of this, it took up much of his time. As far as the date, I accept the view of the close relationship between 1 and 2 Corinthians, that they were probably written within a short period of time. 1 Corinthians probably written near the end of the Easter season or just after the Easter season in AD 57. Paul stayed at Troas for a while and then went on to Macedonia. So this epistle probably was written in the late summer or fall of AD 57. As far as the recipients are the same as 1 Corinthians, so you can go ahead and just refresh yourself on that. But it was a troublesome, carnal, divisive, and really worldly church that needed severe correction. This was not the welcome home and I'm praying for you and I hear great things about you like we would have in Philippians or 1 Thessalonians. This was a confrontational church that Paul had to stand up to. So how to read 2 Corinthians? Since Paul's first epistle had arrived to the church, there had been mounting opposition to his teachings, his personage, and his authority. They have attacked Paul's personality, his leadership, his doctrines, his apostolic authority. You've observed these hypocrites before and see how leaders can mislead people. When you read Paul's first epistle, it seemed to be sound doctrine, but now so many people are attacking him and his writings. There are divisions in the church and other moral problems. You read so that you might understand the perspective of the Apostle Paul. You want to know the truth of his doctrines, his teachings, and the motivation of his heart. You want to know how to restore those who have fallen into various sins. The chaos, the divisions, the factions of the church can only be corrected by the authoritative truth from Paul. You read so that you might know how to follow the Lord and be in harmony with the true believers of the church. There are a few key verses to this longer epistle. First one, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some, a letter of commendation to you or from you? You are our letter, Paul says to the Corinthians, written in our hearts, known and read by all men, being manifested that you are the letter of Christ, cared for by us, written not with ink but with the Spirit of the living God, not on the tablets of stone, but on the tablets of the human heart. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. And then at the end of this epistle, and really the end of both epistles, Paul writes this strong exhortation, this confrontational statement in 2 Corinthians 13:5. After all that he's written, he says, now test yourselves to see if you are in the faith. Examine yourselves. Or do you not recognize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail the test? Yeah, Paul knew that not everyone in the church were real believers. Some confessed Christ but did not possess Christ. And he challenges them to look into their own light, their own behavior. Is Christ Jesus working in you? If you don't sense that, then you've failed the test. As far as the main argument, I suggest that Paul argues that his missionary activity has apostolic authority, as evidenced by his ministry, doctrine, and their changed lives. Therefore, they must separate themselves from sin and from false teachers. I'd like to suggest 4 purposes for which Paul wrote. First of all, to defend himself against the attacks by false teachers at Corinth. Secondly, to complete reconciliation with the Corinthians by encouraging loving acts towards one another. Thirdly, to stress the collection for the destitute saints, particularly of Jerusalem, and express gratitude for their offering. And fourth, to challenge them to examine their spiritual lives and make sure they are true believers, as evidenced by the presence of Jesus Christ in them. As far as themes, some of the themes are affliction and tribulation, the comfort that can come from God, Satan and how he operates, financial collections, sickness and weakness and the cause, jealousy, boasting, commendation by man and God, the abounding work, ministry, and love of Paul, the law and spirit, love and affection, the grace of God, and false teachers. An exegetical outline of 2 Corinthians can be broken down into 8 sections. First of all, Paul greets the Corinthians and praises God as he is the God of comfort, and they needed comfort right now. That's chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. Secondly, Paul explains the change in his plans, why he had to change, and gives them instructions about moral issues. That's in chapter 1:12 through 2:13. In chapter 2:14 through 6:10, Paul explains the commitment, covenant, concerns, and motivation of his ministry. Paul says to them, this is who I am. This is what my heart is. This is what my motivation is. I know that there are those who are questioning it, but let me tell you from my heart. The fourth outline is chapter 6:11 through 7:16. Paul desires them to be separate from unbelievers and reconciled with himself. In chapter 8, verse 1 through 9:15, Paul asks for financial help for the Judean saints and teaches principles for giving. In chapter 10, verse 1 through 12:13, Paul defends his apostolic authority and explains his many tribulations, that his tribulations are a result of his work for God. Seventh, chapter 12:14 through 13:10, Paul plans on visiting them for the 3rd time and exhorts them to examine the quality of their faith. And then 8th, Paul exhorts them to enjoy spiritual living and fellowship with him, with God, and with each other. Chapter 13, verses 11 through 14. Yes, Paul has a tough time with this tough church, and he argues that his missionary activity has apostolic authority as evidenced by his ministry, his doctrine, and their changed lives. Therefore, they must separate themselves from sin and false teachers.